My name is Martin Mattert with the Witness to War Foundation. It is May 8th, 2019, and we're in Punta Gorda, Florida. I'm sitting with Mr. David Thomas Youngblood, goes by Tom, last name spelled Youngblood, who serves in the Vietnam War in the United States Army as a part of MAC-V, serving with the 24th Special Tactical Zone, and also the 42nd ARVN Infantry Regiment, separate. How are you doing today, Tom?
Good, good.
Glad to hear it. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. My first question is, where are you from originally?
I grew up in Montrose, Pennsylvania, a little town that should have died in northeastern Pennsylvania, but it does fracking now, so it's still going.
And tell me about your family.
Okay, I've got a son that lives in Florida, in Punta Gorda. I've got a grandson who lives in Fort Myers. My wife as well. I've got sister-in-laws in various parts of Florida.
Well, growing up, your parents, what were they like?
My parents, I guess not immigrated, moved from Indiana during the Depression to New York State. And I was actually born in Binghamton, New York. My father got into the bakery business in Pennsylvania and eventually had some Krispy Kreme donut shops at Scranton, Wilkes-Barre area. He then retired to Cape Cod, worked a business a while, and they lived mostly in Cape Cod and Florida, and they're buried there. My wife's family also lived in Montrose, Pennsylvania. He was a part of the pipeline that went through many years ago, and most of them are in Florida.
So was there any military history in your family growing up? Fathers?
World War II, I had several cousins all older cousins that were, one in the Battle of the Bulge, two in the Pacific, all kinds of stuff like that. And one, I think his name was Hubert, was actually on a Navy submarine, anti-submarine warfare plane. And they actually sunk a Japanese submarine 7 days after the war was over because the submarine fired on them. And so they sunk it. Sorry about that. Okay. And they were all the cousins were, and then after the war, I got to see them all. I had a favorite uncle, my mother's brother, that was, he actually was a lawyer, got commissioned ultimately in the Army, Air Force. He took care of guys that were coming back with what they called shell shock, battle fatigue, and all that kind of thing. Helped them out with their legal matters. I went to Florida State University. I actually got a scholarship through a private industrial association.
What year did you graduate?
59. Buddy Reynolds was there a couple of years while I was, and he passed early. I mean, he didn't graduate there then. And Florida State then was a land-grant school, and it was 2 years mandatory ROTC. I did 2 years, and I needed the great sum of $27 a month to continue in senior, and I did. Was commissioned in the Army in '59, went on active duty in January 1960 until February 1988.
So I want to ask if you ever thought about joining the service growing up at all?
Oh yeah. Well, because I had the cousins and all that, and they used to tell their war stories and the complaints and this, that, and the other. So yeah, pretty much always.
So you graduated from FSU, and where did you go after commission?
After commissioning, I wanted to come in for 2 years, when 6 months was the in vogue time. And so I had to wait 7 or 8 months to actually come on active duty. Started out at Fort Sill, home of the field artillery. From Fort Sill, I went to Korea, and we were still, that was 1960, there's virtually no roads there, no paved roads. All our guns, howitzers, were still laid on targets. We had to wear uniforms all the time, so we were pretty much on a wartime footing. And
the North Koreans ever take pot shots or anything while you were over
Oh
there?
yeah, we were right just short of the DMZ.
Well, could you
We'd see them.
explain maybe what happened?
Well, they had their observers, we had ours, and they take warning shots back and forth, and nothing serious. Got more serious later on, actually, years later on.
So after your time in Korea, one of three, right?
Yeah, well, I switched to air defense artillery, and I was in the Chicago Gary Defense Station in a town in Indiana. I think it was Porter, really small town, about an hour or so away from Chicago, near Gary, Indiana. And I was a missile platoon leader there. We had our Nike Hercules weapons, and after 2 years of that, I wanted to get back in field artillery. So I got transferred to Germany, back in a field artillery unit, and I commanded a service battery in a battalion for a short time, and then I was A battery, 10th Artillery Commander for, I guess, another year and a half. There I came back to Fort Sill as an instructor, and since then I'd been an instructor, I asked to go to the Infantry Officer Career Course, which Benning is where I did my summer camp for ROTC, and I wasn't really in love with Fort Benning. But I went back to Fort Benning. I did Airborne Ranger School, and then I went to a 9-month infantry officer course, and that came back to haunt me a year or so later. From there, I went to a advisor course, Vietnamese language school, then to Vietnam, and I started out as field artillery advisor. And after a few months, the Vietnamese artillery was so good that they disbanded my team. And my choice was to go in a place called Pleiku and be on staff, the 2 Corps staff, or I could stay pretty much in the tactical zone. And I became an infantry advisor and I was, mostly I worked with 3rd Battalion, 42nd Infantry, and occasionally with other units that would be assigned to the zone, tactical zone.
Well, let's back up. Tell me about when it was you first heard about Vietnam and the war was actually becoming manifest.
Well, actually, it was back in the early 60s. And I think it was Life or Time magazine showed some pictures of some Special Forces guys that were there. And everybody thought, it ain't nothing. And then I was in Germany, and we used to joke, the old joke, it's not much of a war, but it's all we got. So that turned into something else. I would like to make one thing clear. In 1968, we had, and I use the expression very accurately, we had a hard time finding anybody to kill because the VC were pretty much decimated. The effective soldiers, the most effective soldiers were the PAVN, the People's Army of North Vietnam. And they came down in varying numbers, some very well organized, disciplined unit, some ragtag units. And that continued through '69. And my point is that militarily, we had them beat. They were beat. And it's unfortunate that LBJ stopped the bombing, because I've known prisoners of war who said in Hanoi Hilton, the guards were actually making friends with the prisoners because they thought it's all over now. We're going to become a province of the United States, and probably should have happened. But anyway, Nixon did a lot better because we could not. I remember sitting on the border of Cambodia and watching them shoot the hell out of us, and we couldn't do anything back. And we couldn't fly over or nothing. And but Nixon didn't listen to his intel guys, I guess, or read his mail, but they were ready to give up. And so he gave away one of the most beautiful places on earth. And now they're getting less and less communist and going more and more the capitalist way to go. Anyway, that's interesting. Like, if you listen to like our president says, the fake news, which goes way back, that we had lost the war. We didn't lose it at all. That's my point there. But the Vietnamese soldiers were, the units that I was with, it all varied on, the head. If you had good leadership, you had some outstanding soldiers. And that right down to the Binchi, the private level. Great soldiers. They had a hard time actually fielding soldiers like we did. A lot of guys had to stay back, this, that, and the other. And I always thought, you know, we were there for a year or so. We'd go home for 1, 2, maybe even 3 years, and back again. Those guys have been fighting. Some of them had actually fought against the French. Some had fought with the French, and their only way out of the war is get severely wounded or dead. So that was a different. They had a different attitude than what we did, you know.
Well, tell me about some specific ARVN you remember. Any names?
Well, there was a guy named Major Twan, was the artillery, effectively the division artillery commander, battalion commander. He was a very nice guy. He probably had more time at Fort Sill than I did. I then was with a Daiwi on. He was a infantry tactician, brilliant infantry tactician, and he was a somewhat older person. And we worked well together. We didn't like each other, but we worked well together because he liked to do some underhanded things. And I remember him once we were with the battalion and we were on a hill. Now normally, you know, if you got the high ground, you're in good shape. But Dewey says, okay, everybody, march order. We moved to the bottom of the hill. The next morning, mortars started falling on top of the hill where we were. Brilliant. It's one of the things he did. Another thing is that we'd be on the move, and then the bad guys, BC, would attach, they'd get the end of our column. If the U.S. helicopter flew over, they would shoot at it. And then the helicopter returned fire on us. And so the battalion commander, the Daiwi, would say, watch this. He says, I'm going to make the head like the tail. So he took his operations officer and about 20 guys, and they went all the way back to the column until they got to the end of the column, and then they started kicking ass back there. And got about 4 or 5 guys and keep on going. I think one of the, well, 2 things happened that I'll probably never forget. One is I was with a Montagnard battalion commander. He was in the Vietnamese army, but he was a Montagnard, which was extremely rare. And he came, somehow our helicopters got crisscrossed and we landed first. We jumped out, and right behind us was another helicopter came in, and this young man came up to me, American soldier who was a pathfinder, and he said, it's a good thing you had that helmet on, because I tried to dress like the guys I was with, right? So I wore a steel helmet, no mats and all, no tiger suit, none of that bullshit. So he came up to me and he said, good thing you had a helmet on, and he pointed to my chest. He said, I was going to shoot you right here, because we were told this is a hot LZ. And I was kind of speechless at that point. And the other thing I think that scared me more than anything was the Daiwi on was fearless. And we had to cross a major highway. I think it was Highway 14. That's, at that time, about 200 of us got to go across this road. And so the Daiwi was there, and he started turning pale. Then he pulled out his pistol. He had never done that before. And he said, if he's scared, I'm really scared. And we went across without incident and all that, but that was a kick. And I guess it was one of the last major operations. There was a special forces outpost called Ben Het. It was right on a pathway for the North Vietnamese to come across. And they wanted to eliminate that base, so we had a bunch of guys, special forces and other units trapped on that base, and we had to relieve it. And it went on for weeks, and I was involved in about 2 weeks of that directly, where we were there. And I do remember we were in one position, we moved out of the position, and then the bad guys came in behind us, so I talked to an Air Force FAC, and I told him where to put the stuff in. I asked for napalm, he wouldn't do it, because it was too close to friendlies. And after half an hour of arguing, he put some stuff in there, so that was
Must have been quite a sight.
well, got another story that I'm thinking of. We went into another hot LZ, and the Air Force had already been there and bombed it. And we landed, and a horrible stink. And we started finding the parts of people that were buried and stuff. And then there's a tear gas dispenser called a WD or W8 or whatever. And all of a sudden, tear gas starts sprouting off all over the place. Nobody had a gas mask except our artillery U.S. team that was attached to us. So that's 4 gas masks, 200 guys, right? And then the battalion commander is down with a stick, just apparently beating the hell out of this kid that had screwed with that dispenser. And he got down there, and most of it was for show, because he landed about 1 out of every 10 blows and swearing at him. I assume he was swearing, because just being amazing. And then I hadn't taken my boots off in 3 days. I took my boots off, laid down, I'm getting all nice and sunny, and about that time I heard a swish, boom. And I looked up, and another swish, boom. And someone was firing at me with a recoilless rifle from a good distance away. And after the second boom, I got out of there without boots. And later I retrieved that. So that's about all the good stuff that went on.
So you're telling me a few stories about some combat experiences you had with
Right.
the ARVN. I do kind of want to ask some general questions. Did you have any experience with wildlife while you were out there in 2 Corps?
Yeah, not much. I remember. Funny thing, sometimes these guys go fishing, and the way they fished, and this was in up in the mountains, and where Teddy Roosevelt used to hunt tiger and stuff. They take a hand grenade and drop it in the stream. Then they get all kinds of fish, you know, and they sometimes they get a dog, and they eat a dog too, a delicacy. And I've tried it. It doesn't pretty good. And that's about the only wildlife we saw at that.
And did you eat any other Vietnamese cuisine?
Not yeah. Lots of what we did was my team, when we were with the infantry, I had myself and another guy. Usually 2 Americans, sometimes 3 of us. And we had 2 guys, we call them carry boys, but they carried our radios. But we formed the old-fashioned messmate team. And what they loved were these sea rations, little cans of turkey and chicken or whatever. Then they would bring these noodles. And they would make some, I guess, saimin, ramen, whatever you want to call it. Most delicious stuff I ever had. And I still eat it about once every other day. Still eat this. And we'd all pool our stuff, and those kids would cook it and all that. So we had an interpreter too. It was essentially worthless, but he was a college kid, and got to be an interpreter, and that was one thing. And the way I got really my experience though in Vietnam was when there was a lady named Pat Smith, a doctor, who had a hospital, and she treated primarily mountain yards. And the bad guys, BC, came through. Then they wanted the mountain yards to be on their side, and the way they enforced that was they went in and raided the hospital once around Tet time, and they actually took feces, human feces, stuck it in the ears of babies, and then stuck a bayonet through the ears. And anybody's out there liberal and peacenik and all that, I've got no use for them whatsoever. And then there's one of my heroes, I guess, was a Colonel Nguyen Ba Lin. He was a Marine Colonel, Vietnamese, been assigned he was the head of the 24th Tactical Zone, and the regiment was part of that, right? Okay. But he pacified the mountain yards, and what he'd do, he'd capture some of them, bring them in, no mistreatment, feed them, and they'd say, hey, this guy's pretty good, He said, okay, you guys go back to your village, and positive impression. And they had one guy that they had locked up in a cage and didn't hurt him or anything, but they put probably the worst guard ever on him, and they put a guard on him. The guard falls asleep. The guy comes out of his cage because it was unlocked, wakes up the guard to lock him back up again because he didn't want to leave. And towards the end too, and in '69 and stuff, guys were surrendering, and it wasn't like they were surrendering. They're like, if you want to call the current term, asylum. Oh, here I am. War's over for me. These young kids. But anyway, he pretty much turned the mountain yard thing around. He was also very cocky, and he got a really nasty article by Time magazine about the Ben hit thing. In fact, they called his cocky colonel and all that. Unfortunately, he and our senior advisor died in a helicopter crash, but that was he was one of my most favored guys. And he was a North Vietnamese himself, but he was very anti-communist. And
Now, speaking Vietnamese is notoriously a difficult language. Did you ever missay something or misinterpret
well, he had
something?
a very tonal language, and you could mispronounce it. Like, as I remember, Toy Bon means I'm a friend. If you pronounce Toy Bon, it also can mean I shoot. It's all based on the tonal language, and I pretty much lost it. But I know still a few words, but most of the guys I worked with could speak and could speak English very well. Some you could get by in pidgin too.
So you told me about one particularly close call. Did you have any other close calls in Vietnam?
Yeah, I'm trying to think what else. At one time I think I was still with the artillery unit, and my job that day was to evacuate some 105 howitzers out of a fire base. And I could talk to the pilots, and they were coming in, and we started getting some fire in there. So I went in a bunker, and I had Mac, he's a sergeant friend, and I were sitting next to each other. I had about 7 other guys in this bunker, and a radio antenna sticking up. I'm talking to the Chinook helicopter pilot, hooking up the howitzers. The Vietnamese were actually doing the hookup. And anyway, the Chinook came down and it touched my radio antenna. The static electricity came down and it knocked me out. And all I could see was rainbows and stuff. And I said, Mac, that was my sergeant's name. I said, Mac, I'm hit, I think. And the electricity it got everybody in that, because we were all real close to each other, and we couldn't wait to get out of there, get those guns gone and get out. There's other stuff that's come up too. But it's a country that we should have kept. I mean, anything grows, and it's diverse. If you go in the south, it's all very hot, swampy, and north, it's the most beautiful mountains and you ever want to see.
Now, I asked you about some ARVN that you worked with, but tell me about some of the Americans you served with in Vietnam. Any of them stand up?
Yeah, there was most of them. Well, I had one sergeant to work for me, and he's spent most of his career in the infantry, but what he really did, he was a golf pro, and he ran more golf courses than anything. And he told me, he said, I didn't get promoted very much, but I sure had but he was a good guy, and we got him promoted and stuff. But, don't remember. Well, I didn't have that many Americans that I worked with. There was other guys, my equivalent, one guy was an advisor to, was a G4, a logistics advisor. Then he later got a battalion, and we stayed friendly for a while after the war. Other than that, we just kind of filtered away. They attempted a reunion back in 2003 and had some other problems where I never made that one, but it's where they all went to the Vietnam Wall and things like that, but no, it's pretty much gone. I did run into a guy in Hawaii that I'd served with, and he was a scout battalion advisor, and that was in Honolulu. And I know him quite well, and he left Honolulu, and that was the end of that. Right now, nobody. I just, actually, Monday, I was at Arlington Cemetery, and I buried my best friend. And he was a 2-time Vietnamese veteran. But we did not know each other then. We didn't meet until '79, and been friends ever since, so.
That's tough.
Yeah, he went out. He's like he should have. So.
Working with the ARVN, how did you feel when we lost ARVN soldiers being so close to them?
I still remember that. See some of the guys, and then they would have a bad thing, or well, not, sometimes the women, their wives and such, would meet the helicopters as they were bringing these guys in, and that was a bad scene to see.
Was there a big booby trap threat in your part of Vietnam?
No, not to speak of.
Mostly just in VA?
Well, the infantry units ran into them a lot. In fact, we used to do it too. And what we would do is, our guys would make mistakes. They'd put out a booby trap, and then when they went the next morning to retrieve it, they'd make a mistake, and invariably, you're boom, and somebody'd get hurt. And that's, I did have a friend of mine. It was Captain Phil Heckert, was also a battalion advisor, and he went out and on those booby trap things, they set one off, and he got a little sliver in his wrist. But he was en route to, he secured another job in Vietnam as an advisor someplace else, and it had been a great job for him. He was a reserve officer and stuff, and bachelor. So he was going to get his 30 days leave back to States, and he's going to come back. Life is good. And he gets a fragment in his wrist, and he didn't do anything about it. He didn't, no Purple Heart, no nothing. And I said, Phil, you got to do something about that. They got really, really bad infected, and then he had to, he lost it all. And it got serious. Really got infected that bad, so.
Did you get any injuries, illnesses during your time in Vietnam?
Nope. Lucky.
Very.
Oh.
Did you keep in touch back home?
With what?
Family?
What's left of them. It's just my wife and I, son, grandson.
Oh, but like in Vietnam, did you write letters or anything?
Oh yeah, while we were there. We even tried the thing where you have two tape recorders, one at home, one. That worked out with some success. And I did talk to my wife once, but I was on leave in Thailand, and I was one shot, and only a couple more weeks before I was coming home anyway. So we did meet in Honolulu on R&R way back when. That was a good deal.
Very nice.
But you got your fever of unknown origin. That seemed to be a big deal. I got that a couple times, and
What's that like?
just all of a sudden you feel like crap, and you get a fever, then it goes away and you're okay. And we had to take these god-awful malaria pills too that were a big pill you took. And then the hepatitis shots, that was another one that you got about 3 quarts in your butt, that's and it hurt. But we had good times too.
And that water in Vietnam's supposedly not the cleanest.
Right. But we did a lot of drinking, like World War II, I think, too. And now it's all, military doesn't do that at all. But
What was the popular drink in your part of the world?
Just beer and stuff. That was
a specific brand?
some really crappy brands. And they would come in, sometimes there was maybe get in trouble, Carlene's Black Label. And we got a hold of that once, and it was rusty cans and stuff. It tastes like crap. I mean, it was good at the time, but I remember I was out on operation, and we were out 11 days. Normally, our regiment, the Vietnamese, were geared for 5 days. Logistically, they could handle 5 days, and they had to have rice all the time. Had to have rice, cook the rice, and they'd cook it in the morning, and they'd keep the cooked all day long and snack on it. And the Japanese used to do that too. And incidentally, Japanese. The North Vietnamese adopted a lot of tactics that the Japanese used in World War II. And one was the embracing technique, where they would get as close as they could to you so that we couldn't bring in airstrikes and artillery and stuff. And that, patterned so they knew what they were doing. And in fact, I encountered, one time we had some guys shooting at us. We heard what was obviously a forward observer talking, but I was with a Montagnard, the battalion commander, Montagnard. We had other guys there that could speak multi-language. We couldn't break the language. And when we finally figured it was as a Chinese advisor or Chinese artillery, but they were across the border, so we didn't really get them.
That's crazy. So, were there any other stories from Vietnam that were important to you that you wanted to share?
Oh, there's, let's see. All kinds of runs together, you know, with the stuff that had happened.
Oh, I believe it.
Oh, it was strange too. Oh, this Pat Smith Hospital. They had captured one of the nurses, and I believe she was a nun. And they kept her for months and months, and at the end, they got her back and released her. And she was very anti-war, which kind of surprised me. You know, here she's captured by the bad guys for all that time, and they made the propaganda thing about her and stuff. I do remember one thing that was not totally pleasant, but there was a briefing out in the middle of nowhere. There's a couple tents there, and my rank and position meant I was way on the outside. But buzzwords started going around where the head of the Commander-in-Chief of Pacific was there, and it was Admiral McCain, a four-star admiral. And they said, yeah, he's got a son who's captured. And of course, that'd been John McCain, you know. We said, oh, wow, you know. And at that point in time, he's been there about 2 years, I guess. And one of them, I remember too, one of the other battalion advisors I didn't know very well, but we had a joint operation with the U.S. unit. I'll try to make it short. The advisor gets captured by the bad guys. And then some artillery comes in, airstrikes, this, that, and other, and they left him. You know, oh, you watch him, you watch him. And so he was captured for like 3 hours. At the end of that 3 hours, he never saw him again because he was taken, interrogated, back to the States, gone. And one lucky guy. That was my biggest fear, getting captured. You know, I wasn't really, well, you know, death is always there, but you couldn't do much about that. But the captured thing was, did everything you could to not let that happen. And they love to get an American, you know, a white American or black, whatever. And
They have a bounty on your head?
no, they didn't do that as such. But when I was in the infantry career course, one of our platoon leaders, Major Al Pasco, went to Vietnam early, and he was one of these guys that was very, he was take charge guy, and he saw a bunch of guys out there. He didn't like the way they were dressed and their uniforms and stuff. Well, hell, turned out to be VC, and they tortured him to death, and that wasn't too funny either. But it was generally speaking, they were bad guys. You know, so it was, you know, indoctrinated young guys. And we had a lot of old men too, the Arvins. You know, everybody served and stuff. I became.
Well, a lot of those guys have been fighting with the French and
Yeah.
fighting for 20 years.
One of our battalion commanders was, he fought with the Viet Minh against the French, and that was fairly common.
Well, tell me about coming home from Vietnam. What was that experience like for you?
Well, it was not very good because I came home to Montrose, Pennsylvania, and my wife was living, and our sons at the time were living with her parents, and they even tried to make her pay tax for living there. You know, are you a resident or not? Blah, blah, blah. And that didn't happen. So I was out. My father-in-law went to the local pub in a small town, ran into a guy who was a World War II veteran, and I thought a hero kind of guy. He starts giving me a bunch of crap. What are you guys doing? You're wrong, and Jesus Christ, you know. So, like what's going on now, I think it's a wonderful thing, but I guess my negative thought is, where were you guys 50 years ago? You know? And it's totally different. I personally did not run into too much crap except subtly. But I've had friends that were actually got in confrontations and stuff like that. Especially at bars, you know, because you're asking for it. Sometimes at the airport. And,
That's what bars are for.
yeah, right.
Loud conversations that
Right.
go nowhere.
Right.
Yeah, now, did you have a choice to get out of the Army, or did you
No, I was-
want to go
No.
career on it?
No, I was career. I started out as reserve officer, ROTC, and then
Yeah, of course.
I think 3 years later I became regular, and then,
So you didn't even think about getting out?
no, I was going to get out in 22 years. That was, and then I started getting assignments I liked, and I spent 28 years.
So along that timeline, tell me about the, year when Saigon fell in '75. What do you remember?
I was in a course called Armed Forces Staff College, which was like a master's degree level. It was all joint services. It was in Norfolk, Virginia. And Admiral Jeremiah Denton, who was a prisoner of war, he wrote When Hell is in Session, and he was later a congressman. But he would talk to us occasionally, there was a couple hundred in the class. And he would not do interviews as such, but he would show old interviews. But this time he came out and he said, I personally called President Ford and told him to provide air support. And that didn't happen, of course, because Nixon had, promised air support and all that, and that would have broken the back of the communists. And that didn't happen because we had a hostile Congress then, and not that we don't now, but I mean, everybody's caught up in the anti-war thing and all that. I will say that when those guys were killed in what's the university in Ohio?
Kent?
Yeah, Kent State. We made comments, the guard that should have been better trained and shot a whole bunch more of them, but you get the reaction and the other reaction. And I had an attitude after going back to Pennsylvania and stuff, and like I remember the end of World War II, both times, VE Day, VJ Day, and the whole town went wild, and drums and blowing fireworks and the whole thing.
But not for Vietnam.
Oh, hell no. It's like, oh yeah, you're here. What the hell? Yeah. What are you guys doing over there? How come you're doing it?
But it was interesting talking to your cousins, though.
Yeah, they pretty much were gone then, and died young and stuff. So.
No kidding.
Yeah, I got one cousin who's a banker, the most unlikely guy, but he was in the Battle of the Bulge, and he was captured by Dutch troops. Dutch had elements of their, and were in the German army, right? And they let him go. And he said that was funny. They didn't know what to do with him, so they just let him go.
Wow. So a couple other questions. What do you want future generations to remember about Vietnam based on your experiences?
Don't let the politicians run it. You give the job to the military and say, okay, don't screw it up, and here was what you go. And we've got this lady, Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii, is running for president. Except nobody knows it. Pretty much. But she's a major in the Army Guard. She's a very nice person. I know her father was a state senator, and good, but they're opposed, but she's come out very progressive, but her past history doesn't indicate that. She was anti-same-sex marriage and all that, and she did flip-flop, progressive, and she's now against regime changes.
She's anti-imperial.
Yeah, and against the chicken hawks, both sides of the party and all that. And she's the one that she resigned from vice president of the Democratic Party to support Sanders. I think she's gotten over that. But I've written her letters and stuff. I said, because we thought she was a Dino, but she's not. She's come up with her own agenda that doesn't fit anybody. And but it's kind of laughable. And they just got a letter, personal thing from her, sort of personal. And I need $29 because the media has forgotten her and all that. But it's just her attitude that, Jesus, she's a young, far reaching, you gotta be 35 to be president, so it's gotta be more than 35, so.
So, what's one of the most important things you learned personally serving in the Army?
In the Army, integrity. You know, if you say something, you mean it. And
Do you have any leader or maybe a peer, someone just made a big impact on you during your time in the service?
there was Colonel Jack Treadwell, Medal of Honor winner in World War II, was my boss for a while. And the staff job when I was in an Army headquarters in Texas, and he was just a down-to-earth guy and stuff like that. And he told us the story of in Italy. He captured a bunch of Italians, and one of them was an officer. And so they asked him to, and the officer said that I will only surrender to another officer. So he said, "Okay, shoot him." Then the guy surrendered. And that's the way he was, and he would have. And he always saw the bright side. Laid back, and other guys was hard to pick out. There's some real Sharpie guys that I've served with. Some I really don't care about at all, but yeah.
Is there any song that you heard today would take you back to your days in Vietnam?
Yeah, Don Ho's Tiny Bubbles. In '68, there's any place you went and anybody that had a guitar, that song would always appear. But I was my friend's, who I just buried, wife was a civilian in Vietnam when she was like 22 years old. And it was in the 71, 72 time frame. And that wasn't the song anymore. It was moved on to another, I want to get out of this place. But the whole different era was changing the songs on.
Lastly, any words of advice, final thoughts, closing statements for anybody watching this in the future?
I guess get good politicians who let the guys that know what they're doing run it. And we got swept up, LBJ got swept up in he was going to be the civil rights guy, which is a horrible law, where it puts the rights of the individual above the group, and wasn't well thought out, knee-jerk reaction, and just like the thing on the, what do you call it, electoral college, you know. You've been to school, you see what the problem is, you know. If California, the Congress years ago said, well, California and other states, you can only have so many votes. I don't care what your population is. If we went the other way, you could, if they didn't allow that, or did allow that, California would ultimately have so many people, legal and illegal, that they'd be the United States. And that's what's going to happen, you know, electoral college. And I can see their point where one guy in Wyoming's vote counts more than, you know, 10 guys in California, but that's the way it is. We're not a democracy, we're a republic.
Well, we could talk more about this off camera, but I can't thank you enough for taking the time, Mr. Youngblood, to come by and share your stories with me. It's an honor and a pleasure, but more importantly, thank you so much for your service. So it's greatly appreciated.
Thank you.